What if I told you that the greatest danger to civilization is not evil, not corruption, not even hatred, but something far more ordinary, far more invisible, and far more dangerous: stupidity. Now, when you hear that word, you might think of someone who lacks education, someone who makes silly mistakes, or someone who simply doesn't know any better. But what if stupidity isn't about low intelligence at all? What if stupidity is something far more insidious? A force that can turn brilliant, educated, well-meaning people into instruments of destruction. Think about it. A scientist with multiple degrees begins spreading harmful misinformation. A kind teacher starts endorsing extremist ideas. A loving parent suddenly makes choices that put their own children at risk. These aren't villains. They aren't inherently evil. They are intelligent, caring people who have surrendered their ability to think independently. And that, according to German theologian and philosopher Dietrich Bonhoeffer, is the true power of stupidity. Bonhoeffer argued that stupidity is not simply an absence of intelligence. It is the abandonment of critical thought. It's when individuals, under pressure from social systems and group influence, give up their responsibility to think for themselves. And that is what makes stupidity more dangerous than malice. Evil has limits. Evil eventually collapses under its own corruption. But stupidity? Stupidity is convinced that it is doing good, and that makes it nearly impossible to defeat. But here's the terrifying part. Stupidity doesn't only happen to other people. It happens to people just like you and me. It happens when ordinary individuals, under the right conditions, stop asking questions and start repeating slogans. In the 1960s, psychologist Stanley Milgram at Yale University conducted one of the most famous and precise and disturbing psychological experiments of all time. Volunteers were told they were participating in a study on learning. An authority figure instructed them to administer increasingly painful electric shocks to another participant whenever they gave a wrong answer. The shocks weren't real, but the volunteers didn't know that. And despite hearing screams of pain, 65% of participants went all the way to what they believed were lethal levels of electricity, simply because someone in a lab coat told them to. These weren't sadists. These weren't psychopaths. They were normal people. People who, under pressure, surrendered their capacity for independent moral judgment. Bonhoeffer saw the same phenomenon decades earlier in Nazi Germany. He watched intelligent, educated religious Germans abandon their values and support a regime built on hatred and violence. He realized that the greatest threat wasn't a handful of malicious leaders at the top. It was the millions of ordinary citizens who stopped thinking critically and simply went along. From his prison cell, awaiting execution for resisting Hitler, Bonhoeffer wrote one of the most haunting lines in modern history. Against stupidity we are defenseless. Neither protests nor the use of force accomplish anything here. Reason falls on deaf ears. Let that sink in. You can argue with evil, you can resist evil, you can fight it. But stupidity is immune, because stupidity doesn't know it's wrong. Stupidity believes it is virtuous. This is what makes the theory of stupidity so unsettling. It isn't about intellectual capacity. It's about surrender. A surrender of curiosity, a surrender of independence, a surrender of courage. But why do people surrender? Why do smart, capable individuals fall into this trap? The answers lie in psychology, sociology, and even neuroscience. And as we'll explore, the same forces that shaped Nazi Germany are alive and active today, in our media, in our politics, and on our social media feeds. So before we go deeper, ask yourself honestly, have you ever believed something just because everyone around you believed it too? Have you ever shared a piece of information without really checking if it was true? Have you ever silenced your doubts just to fit in with the group? If so, you've already tasted the power of functional stupidity. And if Bonhoeffer was right, understanding this hidden force might be one of the most important psychological insights of our era. Dietrich Bonhoeffer was not a detached academic sitting in a university tower, debating abstract ideas. He was a German pastor, born in 1906 into an intellectual family. His father was a well-known psychiatrist and neurologist, and Bonhoeffer grew up believing in the power of education, reason, and rational debate. But as the Nazi Party rose to power, Bonhoeffer watched something deeply unsettling unfold. He saw professors, doctors, lawyers, clergy, and even family friends, all educated, cultured, and moral individuals, embrace policies and leaders that directly contradicted the values they claimed to hold. These weren't ignorant masses being manipulated by slick propaganda. These were people who had every tool to resist, but chose not to. They surrendered their independence of thought to the comfort of belonging, to the safety of conformity, and to the illusion of certainty. From his prison cell in 1943, as he awaited execution for participating in a plot against Hitler, Bonhoeffer wrote about this phenomenon. He argued that stupidity was more dangerous than evil. Evil, he said, always carries within itself the seed of its own destruction. It breeds resistance. It makes people uneasy. It eventually collapses. But stupidity? Stupidity feels righteous. It feels virtuous. Stupidity is convinced it is serving the greater good, and that makes it nearly impossible to defeat with reason alone. When Bonhoeffer spoke of stupidity, he didn't mean a lack of IQ or education. He meant something closer to what we might call willful ignorance or functional stupidity. It's the condition where people stop thinking for themselves and instead become vessels for slogans, ideologies, and group pressures. He described conversations where he realized he wasn't actually speaking with a person anymore, but with a set of phrases and catchwords that had taken over their mind. They weren't reasoning. They were repeating. And this is what makes stupidity not an individual failing, but a social one. Bonhoeffer argued that stupidity emerges most often in groups, under certain social and political conditions. Alone, a person may think critically, but when they become part of a movement or an ideology, their independent judgment collapses under the weight of a collective pressure. Decades later, psychology would prove him right. In the 1950s, Solomon Asch conducted his famous conformity experiments. Groups of people were asked to compare the lengths of lines and give the correct answer. The task was simple. The correct answer was obvious. But when the majority of the group deliberately gave the wrong answer, something astonishing happened. 75% of participants conformed at least once, agreeing with the obviously wrong choice just to match the group. Think about that. Perfectly rational individuals abandon their own perception of reality to avoid standing out. That is the psychological mechanism Bonhoeffer described in the 1940s, decades before science confirmed it. And it doesn't stop there. Leon Festinger's research on cognitive dissonance in the 1950s showed how our brains struggle when confronted with information that contradicts our beliefs. Instead of calmly considering the evidence, we experience discomfort, sometimes even pain. And so, we tend to reject, twist, or ignore the new information in order to protect our existing worldview. Bonhoeffer saw this in Nazi Germany. Psychology confirmed it in the lab. And today we see it on social media every single day. But why does this happen? Why would the human brain, capable of reason, truth-seeking, and incredible intelligence, so often choose shortcuts that lead us into collective stupidity? The answer lies in both evolution and survival. Our ancestors did not survive by sitting alone, analyzing every piece of information. They survived by sticking with the group. Belonging was safety. Conformity reduced the risk of rejection. Quick decisions often meant the difference between life and death. Our brains are wired to favor speed over accuracy, emotion over logic, and group harmony over independent thinking. These instincts helped us survive as tribes on the savannah. But in the modern world, where complex problems require careful reasoning and independent judgment, those same instincts betray us, add stress, uncertainty, or fear into the mix, and our critical thinking shuts down even further. Modern neuroscience confirms that when people are stressed or overwhelmed, their brains become more susceptible to simplistic narratives, authoritative voices, and groupthink. Exactly the conditions that authoritarian regimes and even modern media algorithms know how to exploit. Consider the Milgram experiment again. Why did ordinary people administer shocks they thought were lethal? Because they were under pressure, uncertain, and faced with an authority telling them what to do. Their brains took the shortcut. Obey the authority. Stay safe. Independent moral reasoning